The first bill we have up today, we'll get right to it, is House File 450, which is Representative Richardson bill. Welcome to the committee, Representative Chair Richardson. I will move your bill. I move that House File 450 be recommended to be laid over for possible inclusion in our Judiciary Finance Omnibus Bill. We now have the bill before us, and Representative Richardson, I believe we have, you have an author's amendment. If you could tell us real quickly what that author's amendment is, and then I will move your amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The author's amendment is merely a technical correction with a typographical error.
Got it. All right. Well, I move the A1 amendment to House File 450, put the bill in the shape that the author desires. Any discussion to the amendment? All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed? All right. The A1 amendment is adopted. Representative Richardson, please tell us about your bill as amended.
Thank you, Madam Chair. House File 450 provides a right to counsel for public housing tenants unable to afford counsel in breach of lease cases. The bill is designed to level the playing field between public housing tenants and public housing authorities, which are represented by publicly funded attorneys. The bill is narrowly tailored and limited to breach of lease cases and excludes cases related to non-payment of rent. Safe, affordable, and accessible housing is essential for family stability, social and economic well-being, and mental and physical health. The impacts of displacing families from their homes has long-lasting negative effects on mental, physical health, family unity, and economic well-being. When we look at mothers who experience eviction, they have significantly higher rates of depression, parenting stress, and material hardship. Children and families that experience eviction are more likely to be placed in out-of-home care, which is associated with adverse childhood experiences, poor short and long-term physical and mental health outcomes, and there are also costly impacts of this to address, including homeless shelters, emergency room costs, school funding, and foster care costs. Extensive research shows that tenants with legal representation are much more likely to avoid an eviction judgment and keep possession of their homes than unrepresented tenants. And Hennepin County data collected between 2016 and 2018 showed how the extent of representation, be it full, limited, or none, influenced tenant outcomes in cases. In all dimensions of the studies, tenants with full or limited representation fared better than unrepresented tenants. A few highlights from the study. Tenants with full representation won 21% of their cases. Those with limited representation won 24% of their cases. Unrepresented tenants won only 11% of cases. 52% of fully represented tenants remained in their home, compared with 48% of tenants with limited representation and only 31% of unrepresented tenants. 78% of fully represented tenants left courts without an eviction filing on their record, while this was only true for 17% of tenants with limited representation and only 6% of those who were unrepresented. Also, notably, the study showed that represented tenants are 4 times less likely to enter homeless shelters. Appointed counsel in public housing cases can be an effective means to stabilize families and communities and reduce burdens on publicly funded programs. We have received questions from counties about the fiscal note, and we are continuing to work with stakeholders to find a funding solution that works for all involved while leveling the playing field between the public housing tenants and publicly funded attorneys. And today I have with me Attorney Larry McDonough and Noah McCord, who will testify on the bill.
Right. Thank you very much, Chair Richardson. We will go to the testifiers. First on the list, I have Larry McDonough. Please introduce yourself for the record and then go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Larry McDonough. I'm Senior Minnesota Counsel with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. I've represented about 10,000 tenants and landlords over around 40 years of practice as an attorney. And I've also been a landlord myself over the years off and on. I just want to say just 2 or 3 very short things about this. First of all, we patterned this bill off of many of the existing court-appointed attorney statutes in Minnesota. So the structure of this is very similar to what we found in commitment, guardianship, quarantine, parentage, and juvenile proceedings. Many jurisdictions around the country are looking at right to counsel, and we see this in cities and states around the country. We chose to focus on public housing tenants for 2 reasons. One, they really are the most vulnerable tenants. The families are very low income, elderly, people with disabilities, and they have a subsidy in their housing so that if they lose, they're not only vulnerable physically because of their vulnerable status, but they're also vulnerable because of their incomes. Their incomes are very low, and these subsidies really make the difference between being housed and not being housed. And secondly, we chose this because it's a very complicated area of landlord-tenant law. I mean, I've done this a long time, and these are the most complicated cases because it's a mix of federal public housing law and administrative law and constitutional law on the federal end. And then on the state end, you also have the law of contracts and the law of real estate. And so all those things mix together to make it a very complicated area where people pro se don't do well on their own. And lastly, in terms of the number of cases, this is a fairly small swath of cases, and we chose that specifically really to keep the funding amount down. When we looked at cases from 2016, the 60 publicly available public housing eviction cases we could find, 50 were from the Twin Cities metropolitan area, Duluth, Rochester, and St. Cloud. And so when you look through greater Minnesota and smaller communities, many had none of these cases or maybe one. And so that was kind of the thought process we looked at is kind of having a smaller kind of financial impact than if we were swinging much broader than this. So with that, I will stop talking and take any questions you might have. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. McDonough. We will go to the second testifier before we get to any questions. The second testifier I have on the list is Noah McCourt. Noah, please introduce yourself for the record and go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Becker-Finn and members of the committee for hearing me out this morning. As you mentioned, my name is Noah McCourt, and I'm a disability advocate here in the state of Minnesota. And I wanted to take a minute to just discuss the way that this would impact people with disabilities. And it personally brings to mind 2 particular stories that I've dealt with in the past few years in regards to housing and evictions and public housing. And the first comes out of Richfield, where an individual had a hoarding issue, and the previous management company had been very supportive of the way that of some of his needs. And when that switched out to a management company that did not have necessarily the experience to support him in that way, he really ended up on the chopping block and ended up being evicted. And I sat in that courtroom as I was watching the eviction proceeding and could very much tell that the heart was there in the legal matter, but really the knowledge base was not. And while it felt to some like justice had been served, to me it really felt like railroading. Railroading an individual who A, didn't have the income level to fight back against an eviction, or B, really even the knowledge base or skills to do it. And so it really just kind of was very, it just kind of ate at me, I guess. And I found it to be very unjust and problematic. And another case in South Minneapolis recently where an individual simply missed a court date and was evicted. And, you know, having ADHD, people always look at that as, oh, someone's just hyper, but it's so much more than that. It comes with a pattern of disorganization and a lot of other aspects that really make it difficult for people to focus and keep up with the sort of rigorous process and work that has to go into fighting an eviction and preserving housing. People with disabilities do have a right to accommodation both under the Fair Housing Act and the ADA, as well as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and other areas of law. And so there are other areas of law that could protect them in ways that, in addition to the ways that Mr. McDonough had mentioned. But we continue to see a need for accommodation and for the courts to really understand disability and the way that it impacts both areas of civil and criminal law. And so we really support this bill, and we encourage the passage of House File 450. And we really see it as being in the interest of justice. Thank you for your time today, and please pass House File 450.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. McCourt. I don't have any other testifiers on the list. Members, any discussion to the bill or questions for our testifiers? Representative Johnson.
Chair Becker-Finn, Representative Richardson, I understand the meanings, the intent behind this bill. I just do have some questions though. One of my concerns is the cost. As we start going down this, there's going to be some funding that's going to be required. I'm just wondering if you can explain if this is going to be on the backs of the counties or the municipality that might own the facility. Is it going to be on the backs of the owners of the properties paying for this? It's going to be back of the county, the state. I'm just wondering what your plans is for funding this program.
I'm guessing that was a question for Representative Richardson. Representative Richardson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Johnson, we are currently working with stakeholders. We're talking not only with the courts, but with the counties as well to find a pathway forward in terms of thinking through funding. As Mr. McDonough stated, we're talking about the scope of this is fairly small. We're talking about 60 cases from sort of that have been pulled from historical records. And I also think it's really important to highlight that there are also savings to be had as well as we look at the increased costs that counties are absorbing in terms of out-of-home placements for foster care, also looking at costs of shelter as well. So it's a nuanced conversation, but we're working directly with stakeholders around that. And I think Mr. McDonough may have something to add as well if Madam Chair would indulge.
Yep, Mr. McDonough.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representatives Johnson and Richardson. Yeah, what I would add is that what we estimate about $1,000 per case on the high end. And so we're looking at about $60,000 statewide for all the cases combined. In some counties, no cases. And
Rachel,
and some more. Thank you.
Yep, sorry about that. Representative Johnson, I will remind members too that we're laying this over, so there's certainly time for conversations to continue about this. Any follow-up, Representative Johnson?
Yeah, just my concern is with the current federal rules on HUD and stuff. A lot of this is taken care of. Regarding some of the evictions and the process that has to go through. So I'm not sure if this is actually needed, but I understand it. But I guess we need to make sure that as we go through this, that we're not doubling up some of the federal and state requirements, making it to a position where the people are going to be, the owners of the property are going to look at a lot harder and maybe not actually rent to some of these facilities if they have to go up through these new rules that we're putting into place for public housing.
Any response, Chair Richardson?
I think I would share a couple of things. I mean, the way that this bill has been drafted, it's focused specifically on, as Mr. McDonough said, the most vulnerable within public housing. And so with that, it's really important to recognize that not only are we talking about sort of an uneven playing field, just in general, we're talking about an uneven playing field with some of the most vulnerable Minnesotans, people with disabilities, seniors as well, and extremely low income families. And right now, when there is a public housing case that is going to housing court, those individuals don't have the ability to have a right to representation. And it's also, I think, really important to look at the data that has been pulled as well to show that with representation, we see better outcomes for families. And we also see reduced costs on our counties and our states as well. And I think Mr. McDonough has something to add as well, Madam Chair.
Mr. McDonough.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representatives Johnson, Richardson. Just two things to add. We are talking about public housing authorities, and so these are governmental agencies. So we're not talking about private landlords like the landlord I used to be. And also that the public housing authorities in these types of cases have their own attorneys. And so it really is about evening the playing field so that there are attorneys on both sides. Thank you.
All right, Representative Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just real quickly, I'm just wondering, I know, I haven't been in eviction court for quite a while, thank the Lord, with a tenant, but I'm just wondering, we go in there and just represent ourselves in eviction court. And granted, we know the business, whatever. It was a learning process for us too, though, by the way. But I'm wondering if these people have to have an attorney come alongside them. Are there other people that are trained to help represent them in just this eviction process? Because to me, it doesn't, no offense to any of the attorneys on the call, but sometimes you're just, it's not needed. There could be other advocates in place of an attorney in cases like this. And I'm wondering if you might find more people that are available to help in those situations than trying to find attorneys, which are kind of in short supply in this sort of realm and dealing with these lower income situations.
Well, I will note it's only attorneys can represent other people in court. So Representative Richardson, I don't know if you have more to add to that.
I think I would just, add briefly that, again, we're talking about a specific cohort of public housing tenants. And within the public housing authorities, there are going to be publicly funded attorneys that are provided for those cases. And so again, we're just talking about ensuring that within that public housing realm, that individuals would have the ability to have access to representation that is government funded, because the public housing authorities are publicly funded as well.
Quick follow-up, Mr. McDonough, and then we're going to lay this bill over. So I'm sure that Chair Richardson will be open to further discussing the details to figure out how to get this done this year. Response, Mr. McDonough.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Scott and Richardson. Part of the reason why the public housing authorities do assign attorneys to these cases is because they are complicated. I mean, from when I was a landlord, a non-payment of rent case is not as complicated in private housing. But the types of cases we're looking at here with the mix of federal law and state law really does make them more complicated. And having an attorney for the tenant to balance off the attorney for the housing authority just adds the due process that I think we all like to see in the court system. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. McDonough. And with that, I will renew my motion that House File 450 as amended be laid over for possible inclusion in the omnibus bill. Thank you, Chair Richardson, and your testifiers for being here today. The bill is laid over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.